You're listening to Teka Teka, and in this episode, we ask a pressing question. Why do we let old leaders, old values, and old voters run the world? It's a question that has been increasingly urgent this 2024, dubbed by the United Nations as the Year of Elections. This largest year in election history will see 3.7 billion voters across 72 countries go to the polls. I'm Carl Javier, CEO of PumaPodcast, and I'm joined by Teka Teka Senior Editor Roby Alampay
Hello.
and Teka Teka reporter Bella Perez-Rubio.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, so dadaldal lang ako ng kaunti. Maybe a good question to get us started is, do we think that old people, old voters, and old values actually run things? Ako, I do. Because I've been reflecting on how some of the issues that we've been covering even in the last month, like divorce, sex ed, soji rights, these are being prevented by strongly conservative views, and they're issues that have been blocked for decades, like literally. And in that same reflecting, ever since I had political awareness, nung freshman ako in college, kanyan, we've been talking about charter change, political dynasties, weak political families, presidential versus parliamentary. It's all the same stuff. We're talking about the same things. It's even the same names, except maybe it's just younger faces representing those same names. So when I say old, I'm not just thinking about literally old people, although that's also true. Whether we're talking about Biden, Trump, or Digong, or the Marcos name, all of those are old, no? Especially we've been also talking about Enrile. But it's also the way that old values and old ways of thinking continue to shape our options and even the way that we are able to imagine our society. So I'll go first old, then young. Sorry, Robbie, ito na naman ako, tumitira na naman ako. Pero we'll start with you, Robbie. As someone who,
Oh,
I don't know,
okay lang, Gid.
there's not a totally significant age gap, but there is one where I do see you as a an older generation, and when we sit down, we seem to
Hmm.
be talking the same language. How is this landing for you?
Ako, uh, as you know, I tend to be, and not only tend to be, I think I pride myself in saying I'm an optimist. And obviously, getting younger is more optimistic than saying that no, we're conservative and we stay with old values and old ways of doing things. But I actually think, uh, let's put it this way: I don't know if the young are the ones who are running the show now. I don't know if the young are the ones who are going to change the complexion of our Congress, for example, in the coming elections, or for that matter, the LGUs. But I think clearly in the last decade, the young have had their impact. We can go into it in further detail later, but even the things that you mentioned, SOGI, gender rights, even divorce. Um, in these things, the young have clearly had impact. Let's talk about the RH law. Diba? That's something that we were saying the exact same thing. Ilang dekada na natin pinag-uusapan to, but we have an RH law. SOGI is something that we now talk about much more openly, and that has palpably gotten more support in Congress, in both houses of Congress, and you have some representation already also in Congress, di ba? You look at um, Congresswoman Romulo in Congress, and this was unthinkable many years ago. And then finally, divorce. Yeah, not just the fact that we are much closer to, at the very least, having a serious look at it, and you have a house of in Congress now seriously pushing it to the point that it is the Catholic Church that is panicking. I think all of these are indicators that there is change, and part of that change is young people being heard.
I think that's a fair point, but and I like the optimism, but also nga, ibabalik ko na, oh, pero high school pa lang ako, ito na yung issues eh. And maybe it's fair, like it does take this long for politics to happen, and so, or for change that is at a societal level to happen, and maybe that's me as an impatient person seeing that my generation is almost there to influence, but not yet in control. And so I wanted to ask Bella, who um, I have just found out a few minutes ago. I'm older than your mom, so you should be bringing a fresh perspective to this. I think you were uh, by the time na nagrally ako, you were still a toddler. So how are you seeing sort of from the position of a young person, and like mostly everyone who's running things is older than you, literally.
Yeah. Well, I think I probably land somewhere a bit closer to what you described, which is I acutely feel how old leadership is and prevailing ideas are when we debate issues that I feel should have been settled a long time ago, or I've seen have been settled in other countries, the right to certain rights that have been afforded to people in other countries that here are still under debate. So definitely I feel that. In terms of leadership locally, I mean, I think in the Philippines, comparatively, we've been lucky enough that the actual people in charge are not that old if you compare them to elsewhere. I mean, if you're following US elections, then, you kind of look at our leaders and say, at least they're not that old, or at least that's how I feel, though I acknowledge that's a very low bar. But I think where I feel that difference in age and perspective most is when things are really when we're in crisis and the people in charge step up to answer or try to meet that moment, and the ways of thinking are so old. So I'm thinking of Palestine, I'm even thinking of the COVID response, all those things. It really brings up a knee jerk reaction for everyone, and you can see that generational difference in terms of response. So that for me, I mean, I feel that I'm confronted with it all the time, and I'm confronted with it usually when it comes to issues that I actually I care very deeply about.
Quick follow up there.
Hmm.
When you say the generational response, is there
Hmm.
a specific, like let's be specific here. For
Okay.
example, sa COVID, what is a
Hmm.
quote unquote generational response that you think young people would not have done?
I think when we talk about, how much we should be there for each other in times of crisis, I think the older generation was very much like, I mean, leadership, for example, I felt that it was very much about discipline and order, and making sure that no one is stolen from, no one is taken advantage of, businesses run well, big businesses run well. But I think in terms of welfare, people who are living day to day and had to wait for example, new rules every 2 weeks, that's not sustainable or possible or fair for people who make their money that way. But that's how we were forced to live for over a year, right? Every 2 weeks, the rules change. You're not sure if you can work in the next 2 weeks, and you live day to day. So that's kind of what I mean.
So I think there's like a compassion perspective level here. Now we do understand like the younger generations are a little more aware about being compassionate and caring in their responses. Paano man, Robbie, I wanted to throw something at you because I think your generation is in the driver's seat. And if I'm to be honest, no, parang as someone who is barely at the fringe of Gen X and Millennia, I thought that the Gen Xers would kind of take over and make things better. And I'm also in a moment where I'm watching people of my generation get elected, and they have the names, so they have the same names as the previous generation, but they're doing the same thing. They're not advancing things or being more progressive in the way that I wish they were. And so how was that for you, seeing that generation and even this new one?
I'll tell you a story. In 20 in when was that? Early 90s. My generation of student leaders at the University of the Philippines, mga alumni, even a few people that I had considered oldies in our generation, we formed a group called the Pilipinas 2020. So this was about more than 30 years ago. And ang explanation lang sa and we came from a range in the political spectrum of UP, no? Merong mga samasa all the way sa merong tugon, and at that time meron pang tinatawag na ISA, ASA, and so on. But that's the full spectrum of the parties. And one of our friends convened this group, and it was just a group for us to meet people that we got to know. We got to have breakfast with Idiorak. We got to have breakfast with Salonga. We got to have breakfast with Enrique Isabel. It was just, oy, mag-volunteer kayo ng pwede natin kausapin. And then let's just talk about the country. Etong Pilipinas 2020, the name lang yung gusto ko ikwenta. The point of Pilipinas 2020 was 2020, perfect vision. But also the was 2020, by the time it's 2020, we will all be in our 50s. And precisely what you said, Carl. The point is that by 2020, we will be in our 50s. We will be in the driver's seat. And so our generation, by this time, will either deserve credit or take all the blame. And we cannot blame Salonga anymore. We cannot blame Yorak. We cannot blame the Zobels and the Ayalas of that generation. Tayo na. So that's the question, di ba? And some of these names I won't mention because you will recognize them, but they are in national politics. Some of them are now in the Senate. I've now, I'm part of a major media network. Some are very powerful lawyers now. Some are very powerful businessmen. And we ask ourselves, did we do how are we doing? And I gave the same answer as kanina. I think there are indicators that I think we did good. Um, but at the same time, there are things where we publicly call each other out. As some people here may know, diba? We've called out other people, not that they were part of the Pilipinas 2020 group, but there is at least one that I have called out in social media and saying that, wait, this was not the politics that we thought we would be representing. And so there's that. So I think the answer is yes or no. I hope that's not a cop out. But it's unfortunate that you didn't see the politics during our time because there were really very high standards that clearly we are not living up to. And at the same time, there are things that, like I said, that when you look at it objectively, I do think you have indicators that things have changed. Not all because of politics, a lot of it because of technology, also. But I do think there has been improvement, and so our generation, I think, deserves blame and deserves some credit.
Before I go to Bella, one, I do want to acknowledge also, I think it is in the nature of youth to be impatient about change and to have higher expectations of things having changed. And also want to acknowledge that probably around the same time you were having those conversations, yan yung, I remember yung political awakening ko in the 90s, and there was a lot of hope and a lot of political engagement of for teenagers at the time, right before we could vote, but we were already feeling engaged, and we were feeling that we were a part of it. And for some reason, I don't know what's happened in the last 20 years, but for me, there's been a definite drop off in the feeling of being able to engage in an act change. So I think that's where I'll go to Bella and ask, like, for the generation now where it does feel, I parang compounding challenge yan eh. If if Robbie's generation had that, and then my generation had this, and now ayan ka looking up at like what you have to look ahead to and the kinds of problems that are there, particularly, I was prepping for this and I just kept thinking, my God, taon-taon may chacha. Like, since I could not understand what the term meant because I couldn't understand what the Constitution was, chacha na yung usapan, tapos hanggang ngayon yan pa rin. So how are you looking at this, and how do people, the people around you, how are you talking about these seemingly intractable issues?
I mean, you mentioned Chacha. There is this feeling that every year the same discussions occur and we don't really make progress on those topics, and every year we're made to feel as if they're new they're new tensions, new problems. But if you do the barest minimum of research and you find that it's the same each year. So I think, you know there's probably a spectrum among people my age. Maybe the people who are yoked to the news and follow these issues, they know that it's the same rehashing every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. And then there might be other people who are being presented with all these problems, with all this historic baggage. And that kind of also makes them want to let go. I think on both ends of the spectrum, you're like, all of this for me to deal with. I mean, and it for Chacha, for example, it's an issue that always is in stalemate. Like you bring it up, it dies down. You bring it up, panic starts, it dies down. It's exhausting. I mean, even just experiencing it twice or thrice, and you kind of already feel the that weird pointlessness of it all setting in. So yeah, I think for people my age, it's compounding problems, it's old problems, and I think a lot of us feel that we didn't start these problems, and now we have to take them on as if they belong to us, and in a way they do, but in some ways they don't.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think what I'm seeing with people my age is a lot of being overwhelmed, which is fair. But then, in response to that feeling of being overwhelmed, maybe letting go a bit and, kind of turning your back on politics as a whole
Mm-hmm.
because it's exhausting.
One zoom out kind of question to lead us to the end of this conversation. We are seeing the same issues, the same challenges being brought up. But one thing I've been thinking about is, is it the conservative values? And one thing I was thinking about was, now that I'm middle aged, have my have the values of my generation shifted? Where, for example, if I were in my 20s, I'd be like, of course, dapat may sex ed. But if it's someone my age na parent na, do they really want their fifth grader, sixth grader, eighth grader getting sex ed already? And nagkakaroon na ba ng shift? So I'm wondering if it's not just the issues, but it's also the way that we hold our values and the way that those values might shift as we get older. Robbie, you seem like you have some
Yeah,
thoughts.
yeah. Meron. I mean, take sex ed, 'di ba? And it's remember part of the ano is ayun nga, reproductive health na ang tawag natin diyan, 'di ba? Parang kasama na lahat ng pag-uusapan. But if you look just at the question of sex ed, it's now part of the law, right? And it is now something that we can hold our policymakers to account, and local government and the church na ano, parang andyan 'yan, eh, kailangan ng pag-usapan 'yan. And so that's actually an indicator that something has improved. Notwithstanding not having even to answer, is it still a conservative society? You mentioned kanina, all of this will lead to compounding problems. That's true. But there's also compounding moving forward. Diba? You build on top of things. I imagine this again, talking about Soji. And let's take it outside of the Philippines. During the time of Bill Clinton, diba? A liberal, and one of the most progressive images of American leadership or global leadership. Anyway, he was in his 40s, like Obama, when he became president of the United States. What was the most progressive? What was the most progressive impact and legacy of Bill Clinton in his time with respect to Soji? And Soji wasn't even a term that we were using before. You remember? It's don't ask,
Don't ask,
don't
don't
tell.
tell. Yeah.
That's it. And that's literally it. The most progressive thing that Bill Clinton did um, in the 1990s, 30 years ago, was to say that if you enter the military, tumahimik ka na lang at hindi kami magtatanong. It's literally what don't ask, don't tell means. I was trying to figure that out when I was younger, and because I couldn't fathom that, that's it. That's all it's saying. Ikubli mo na lang, and on the state's part, we will not ask. But it was in fact progress at that time. At that time it really was progress in the sense that it allowed um, people of any gender to join the U.S. military and to serve. And fast forward to that now, we look back at this and napaka-backward naman ng thinking na yun. But the reality is you did build on top of those things. And I think that's one way of looking at of change. I also think that there are times that well, as you grow older, there are things that change with you in terms of the conservative values. And I do think now, I think much more practically about the environment. I do think now there is a balance between, loving the environment, protecting it at all costs, and also being practical and saying that no, but this has certain policies have kept people from investment. Some certain policies have kept people from looking at technology, how technology can play a role, and I think that has allowed us to balance things. So that's how I look at it. Things change, and I remember also in the same way that you're thinking, how will our generation be when we grow older? I also tell myself, I remember how I was when I was younger. One last thing na lang about this particular generation, because it is peculiar to this generation growing up. I mentioned kanina technology. Somebody I saw it on Twitter a long time ago. Is social media making us lazier activists? And that's something that the older generation can honestly tell the younger generation, because we didn't have social media. We couldn't just post our position and leave it at that. We had to go out in the streets. We had to express our anger, sometimes physically, and sometimes and very often in person. But that's a real reflection for all of us, but certainly for a generation that has seen nothing else other than having a digital life and seeing social media. Does it make us lazier activists?
Oh, I appreciate this. The moral arc of history is long kind of perspective, and as you get older, you do see opportunities for change. But I want to close out, Bella. How is this for you, naman, as a younger person seeing this? And does this provide hope, or does this provide more of a push for what you think your generation needs to do?
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to everything I just heard. But for me, I think that is the value of having more young people in charge. Just
Mhm.
calling back to what we've been talking about throughout this conversation, there is a sense of urgency and impatience with young people. And I think given all the challenges that we're facing, that's what's necessary. I've already accepted that the older I get, I will probably be a bit more conservative, be a bit less open-minded, hopefully not closed-minded. But I think that's why it's important for people my age or a bit older to start taking leadership roles, because that sense of urgency is necessary, that reckoning with what values are still valuable and still serve us and worth keeping, and what values do we have to do away with because they were
Yeah.
inherently discriminatory, inherently ignorant, there were just things we didn't know. I think that's important. So, calling back, for example, to the discussion about sex ed, and reproductive health. I was still in college when Catholics, I was in Ateneo. Ateneo still felt the need to defend the fact that they supported the RH bill. And, I mean, I'm glad that they did, but that is a very comparatively very slow conclusion that we came to compared to other countries. And when I
Hmm.
think about where we are on abortion, for example, compared to other
Hmm.
countries, our Commission on Human Rights almost lost their budget this year or last year because they were called out for having one statement where they softly encouraged the decriminalization of abortion, because statistically several women in the Philippines die each year, many women die each year of trying to get unprofessional abortions. I mean, other countries have reckoned with this, they've settled it, they've either decriminalized it or fully legalized it. And we're still, threatening our rights body for
Yeah.
saying that maybe we should make it safer for women who have to get abortions. So, I mean, for me, it's not fast enough. And I'm sympathetic to the fact that small gains are being made by well meaning people, but considering the challenges and what's at stake, I just feel that it's not enough.
I appreciate that because basically clock is ticking. And I do think that abortion is going to be one of the toughest battles, especially for our
Yeah.
country, just because it's like people don't even want to talk about it. As
Mhm.
as we wrap this up, one thing I want to note is a lot of our progress conversation centers around social issues. and very little of it is political. It means that politically we are still really mired in kind of the same patronage politics, crony capitalism. The fact that the names are the same is still something we haven't addressed. But I think it can also be addressed by what Bell is saying. We need more young people, and that's a different topic. But asking the question of where is our AOC, but where's that batch of young uh, progressive liberal people who have the charisma to advance new values and new thinking within our society. Yeah, go ahead, Robbie. You wanted to say
Yeah,
something?
meron lang kayo dadagdag, in every generation, the answer for every generation is they're there. They were there. I mean, during our generation, the 30-year-old phenom was a mayor from Naga, Jesse
Mm,
Robredo. And he was a mayor in a small town in Bicol. And during our time, matunog na yun. There's this young kid in Naga. I actually heard of Jesse Robredo, particularly in one of those Filipinas 2020 conversations
mm,
with Enrique Zobel. And we asked him so, and then we asked him, who are the young people that you see? And he said, there's this young guy in Naga, used to be with BPI, entered politics, and so on. So he's there. There's this guy in Olongapo. He really believed in Richard Gordon at that time. When nung pumasok si Miriam Defensor Santiago at saka sila Frank
mhm,
Drilon, people were saying, alam bang magkabatch yan sa UP Student Council? We were young enough and they were young enough for people to contextualize them. And that's the reality in every generation you will see that there are these people. I don't know how they will eventually turn out in
yeah.
10 years from now, but my daughter's friend is a vice governor in a province very close to Metro Manila. She's younger than Bella. Diba? And Bella, I'm sure you have friends who are now counselors. I'm sure you now have friends who are in politics. Final point ko na lang. So I was talking to one of these of my friends from Pilipinas 2020, and we were chatting and said, now, what do you think? And he was on the opposite end of me. I think he said, I think we failed. I think we deserve the blame. And then I asked, do you think we are hard on ourselves? Because when we ask ourselves, how is the country? And do you see progress? When we answer, we actually are only thinking of the national politics. We're looking at Congress, we're looking at Malacanang, we're looking at Chacha, we're looking at all of these the big questions at the national level, which are important. But I think this is a point mo, Carl. We're not asking, yeah, but how's the environment? Is there any indicator for progress there? The economy, did it grow? And I think objectively, it grew. Diba? It grew. Whether or not it was equitable is a different conversation. Is this a more high-tech society than it was in the 1990s? Certainly, it is. And do you still see young people participating? I think you look at local government, the answer has always been there. Diba? So I think I will go back to the original question and remind that let's answer that. Are we improving? And are we becoming more progressive? And be honest with yourself. When your first reaction, are you actually just answering the question of how's our national politics? Diba? And I think if you look beyond national politics, you will have a richer basket of answers that is more nuanced per sector, per issue, other than just it's easy to answer on the national politics. We will all agree on that.
Yeah, I think we can definitely agree now on the national politics level. That is what we are seeing. But even at the local level, sometimes the names might be the same, but thankfully they might represent different things. So totally different conversation na yun, yung but looking forward, seeing who's going to step up and who we can support so that we can have those values. So thanks for listening to this episode of Teka Teka. Thanks Robbie and Bella for having this conversation with me. If you found this insightful, pakishare naman. It would mean so much to us if you did. This episode was hosted by me, Carl Javier. It was edited by Pidoy Blanco, and make sure you follow Teka Teka on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts so you can continue to get slow news that matters to you.